So in chapter 21, verse 1 through 4, we see the coming of the new. And I want to read a quote from a commentary which I thought was well written about this transition. He says, from the smoke and pain and heat of the preceding scenes, it is a relief to pass into the clear, clean atmosphere of the eternal morning where the breath of heaven is sweet and the vast city of God sparkles like a diamond in the radiance of his presence. It just reminds us that that is a horrific and a difficult scene of God's justice and his holiness. But that's not the end. We have a beginning. So let's start with verse 1. It says, "Then I saw a new heaven and new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea." So John's saying he saw something that was new. The word new means brand new. It's not previously in existence. This is new in kind, and not just another heaven and earth just like the one you know, but this is going to be new. It's going to be a different kind of order. But there is some kind of continuity. Unlike the earth and the heavens that we know, that earth and that heaven will be eternal. It will be perfect. And John says that the first heaven and first earth passed away, which he's already communicated. And this word here is a little different word, to pass away, but it simply means to be gone and to be departed. It went out of existence. And then it's curious at the end there, he says, and there's no longer any sea, which is interesting. I kind of like sea life in the sea. So what does he mean there? It probably communicates two things. One, the sea in scriptures are a reference and a connotation of evil. It's the principle of disorder, of violence, of chaos, the chaos of the sea, of unrest that marks the old creation. So by saying there's no sea, he is communicating that whole order of life where there is actually evil and chaos, it will be no more. But I also think that there's not going to be any literal sea either. And thus nothing that divide people or divide the nations and divide the earth. Nearly 3/4 of the earth right now is covered by water. Then I think it'll be mostly all earth. We know in some of the descriptions at the end there's rivers and lakes, but I think there's no sea. So the concept of new heaven and a new earth is both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. So looking at just a few others, in Isaiah 65:17 it says, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things will not be remembered or come to mind." Have you ever had like a crying child, and then all of a sudden you give them something new or something different, maybe a candy or a toy or something, and all of a sudden whatever was making them cry disappears? That's kind of the idea here. This new heaven and new earth is going to be so fantastic, so wonderful, you're not going to remember the things of the old earth. Isaiah 66:22 says, "For just as the new heaven and new earth which I make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so your offspring and your name will endure." This kind of new heaven and new earth lasts forever. It's eternal. And then in 2 Peter 3:13, which we've already read this morning, it says, "But according to his promise, we are looking for a new heaven and new earth in which righteousness dwells." It's going to be new and a different kind because unlike our earth, our reality, there will only be righteousness. No one can sin. It's an impossibility. It's new. It's a new order of righteousness where everything is created to last forever. Now I want to draw your attention to Isaiah 65 again, and I want to read the next verse. The first verse obviously talks about the new heaven and new earth. The next verse says, "But be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem for rejoicing and her people for gladness." So in verse 1 of chapter 21, John sees the new heaven and new earth. And in the second verse, he records, "And I saw a holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of the heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband." Do you see he's following the same pattern, the same steps as Isaiah. Here he says, I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem. That word new is the same as before. This is a new kind of Jerusalem. There's continuity, but this is a better one. And it's holy, it's set apart, it's different. It's unlike any city that you've ever previously known on earth. Like any city, Jerusalem refers to not just its structure, its walls, its building, but also the people that are in it. And they are holy. They are a new people, ones that are glorified. And in a city, the concept of people in a city, it connotes a few things. One, it connotes that there's relationships, there's activity, there's responsibility, there's unity, there's socialization, there's communion, and there's cooperation. But there, it will be all righteous. It'll be like any city that we've ever known. It would be completely different. Where we live, where we work together, there'll be perfect harmony. The meaning of the name Jerusalem is debated. The Salem part means peace, but the first part, Jeru, is debated. It probably means, most scholars think it means something to do with a foundation of peace or founded in peace. And so here, by saying this is a new Jerusalem, this is a new place where the foundation, or it will be founded in the peace of God, in the peace that is being with man. And the New Jerusalem that's coming down is described as being ready as a bride. Now, being ready is a passive there. It doesn't make itself ready. Someone is doing it to it, and that's God. God has made both the city and its people ready. And it's described as a bride adorned for her husband. Now, it's fascinating. The word for adorned is the verb kosmeo. Does that sound like an English word you know? It means to order or to arrange. And it's what we say when we talk about cosmetics. So literally, when women put on their cosmetics, they're taking things that are out of order and putting them in order. And so here, the bride has become appropriately ordered in all of her beauty to be here in God's perfect reality, perfect universe, perfect creation. So a bride that's adorned on her wedding day is usually decked out in fine clothing and jewels. In Revelation 19:7, it says, his bride has made herself ready. It was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean. For the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. So here as well, just like parallel to 2 Peter, the bride, Jerusalem, and the people that are in it are characterized by being completely righteous. And thus beautiful. That looks beautiful. Have you ever heard someone say, hey, that was ugly, when you did something wrong? When you do sin, you do things that are wrong, it's not really attractive. It's not something we like. But when you do something that's right and righteous, it's beautiful. So if everything that we did, if every action and behavior we do is perfect and righteous, it is beautiful. And that's the image it gives here of the bride. And this kind of righteousness can only come from God. So the city that's from above, that's coming down, because it's coming from God and God is perfect, it's perfect as well. And it has been built by God. And that coming down stresses the idea that this is a gift from God. This place to live, to dwell. And it will forever mark the bearers of his creation and his design. This is the city in existence that we long for, that we can't find here on earth. And in fact, the Bible says that we're strangers here on earth. Aliens, and our home is really somewhere else. And we hope for a city where all of God's people are. And all of God's people throughout history have longed for this same kind of city, the same kind of dwelling, fellowship with God, like we saw in the Garden of Eden. And I want to show you in Hebrews where this is recorded. In Hebrews 11, starting in verse 9, it says, by faith Abraham lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. That's the city we're talking about in Revelation. That's the promise that he's looking forward. Verse 13, it says, and all these died in faith, those other children of Abraham, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, those promises of God, of this city, this dwelling, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. This is not their home. Their true home is with God. Verse 16, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. We see in Revelation, it's that city. It's that promise. It's coming to fruition. It's coming into reality. So just as God's promises strengthened and gave Abraham and his descendants hope, its purpose in being recorded in Revelation is to give strength and hope and faith and resolution to the church, both in Revelation and in our day, to face our trials, to face the difficulties, knowing that we have a reward, a better land, a better city coming. Now, returning back to Isaiah 65, let's look at the third part. The first part was new heaven, new earth. The second part we saw is I create Jerusalem. The third part says, I will also rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. That verse communicates that God will be there in Jerusalem and with his people. John records in verse 3, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them. And they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. Like before, this loud voice from the throne is probably an angel, maybe one of the four living creatures that are around his throne. It's coming from the direction of the throne, but it's coming with the authority and the truth that comes from God. And it tells us that God's desire and rule from his throne is to dwell with his people. And thus he has done everything to bring this to pass. The word for tabernacle there and the word for dwelling, it both comes from the root that means a tent, to pitch a tent. And it harkens back to Exodus, where God dwelt in a tent among his people. In Exodus 29:45, it says, I will dwell among the sons of Israel and will be their God. The point there that he was literally there and he had fellowship. Although there was barriers there, he had fellowship and he lived among his people. In Leviticus 26:11 talked about when the people are holy, it says, moreover, I will make my dwelling among them, and my soul will not reject them. I will also walk among them and be their God, and you shall be my people. There's a fellowship, a union, a life there. Although in the Old Testament, there was barriers. In the New Testament, in John 1:14, it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt, that same word, to tabernacle, dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. These verses that talk about God dwelling or tabernacling among people foreshadow the perfect life of God in his new creation. The perfect life that we will have with God in his new creation. So no longer will he be far off, be distant, transcendent. No longer will he be in a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, separated by walls and curtains, inside the Holy of Holies, or veiled in human flesh of Jesus, in the human form of Jesus. He will be completely and openly with us. Notice the emphasis of this in the repetition of this verse. First part is, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men. By saying behold, this angel is bringing our attention to something that's really important. And so he's saying, pay attention to this new fact. This is something that's new. And he's saying that the tabernacle of God, the dwelling of God, is among men. His presence again will be among humanity, as it was in the wilderness and temple, but now to a greater extent. And it says, and, number 2, he will dwell among them. Notice it changes the tense of the verb. It's the tabernacle is, and now he will dwell among them. It's not something that's temporary. In the Old Testament, God's presence left. here it's emphasizing that this is not temporal, but it's eternal. This is forever. Then it continuing on, and number 3, they shall be his people. This speaks that not only that God is there, but they're going to have a relationship with him. And that relationship is one of grace. And literally in Greek it says his peoples. It's actually plural, referring to both Jews and Gentiles who are in Christ. They will be his peoples. And number 4, God himself will be among them. He will be among them, literally will be with them. There'll be no barriers, no veils. God will openly live in perfect harmony with humanity, very similar to the conditions in Eden. So let's return one last time to Isaiah 65, where the last part says, "And there will no longer be heard in her the voice of weeping and the sound of crying." Guess what we have next in Revelation? "And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning, or crying, or pain. The first things have passed away." The first heaven and earth referred to the whole order of life in this world. And that order is tainted and distorted by sin, by death, by suffering, by idolatry. And it is an enemy. And that enemy has done this to that old order of things. So now that God has defeated that enemy and has liberated his people and his creation, this is now a reality. There's no more effects of sin. There is no more death or crying or mourning. There will be only joy and praise and peace. This promise is made in Isaiah 25:8, where it says, "And he will swallow up death for all time, and the Lord God will wipe away tears away from all faces, and he will remove the reproach of his people from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken." He has spoken. This is an unbelievable promise, and it's hard for us to understand that kind of reality. But he's spoken. It's going to happen. And this is a complete reversal of the curse of Genesis 3. It describes a reality that's truly new to us, and it's what our hearts long for. It's something that we can't figure it all out. And notice, John hasn't spent a lot of time describing it, because any words that he's going to put to it will not be sufficient. It won't really capture all the goodness. Paul talks about no eye has seen, no ear has heard what things that God has prepared for his people. I want to close by just reading the next first part of the verse, where God himself summarizes this. "And he who sits on the throne said, 'Behold, I am making all things new.'" That is our promise, the new beginning, a new reality. So let's move to applications and main points. First, every sin, every cause of sin and result of sin will be eradicated in the great final judgment before the throne of God. Everything will be reconciled to God in their proper place, preparing the way for the new heaven and the new earth. Number 2, the lake of fire is an eternal punishment for those who reject God and the gospel of his Son, where his offer of forgiveness of sins and the righteousness of Jesus are given freely to those who come to be reconciled with their God and Creator. There is nothing more serious than the potential of living forever in the lake of fire apart from God. As believers, this reality, this truth, should loosen our tongues to share God's gospel, because we do not wish this on any person. But pray for everyone to be born from above, as we have been, to receive grace and love as we have been. The lake of fire needs to motivate us to live the gospel and to speak the gospel. And then number 3, we long for and set our hope in a new reality, the new city, the new life of God, with God. This is the glory that is not worthy to be compared to the momentary present suffering. Romans 8:18. We must rely on this reality, this hope, which is our inheritance, to give us present joy, present peace, and a continual endurance in faithfulness and loving obedience to Christ. We must see our mud pie treasures of this world in relation to the unspeakable existence that is really beyond our comprehension, which awaits us in the new heaven and earth. Live with a new heaven and earth perspective.